Well, we are very happy and lucky to have Will Ciconte of the University of Illinois at Urbana campaign to introduce today with us his topic on how auditor commercialism is related to audit quality and efficiency. And when you sometimes look into op-eds, people sometimes leave, even in Financial Times, leave messages like commercialism is always wrong. It's just wrong. Well, that remains to see whether that's the case or not, right? And even if even there may be circumstances where it is wrong, but then we would need to know what are the determinants of why and when it can be wrong or when it can be good. And sometimes maybe quality improves while efficiency deteriorates, and the other way around. We don't know. But I am very happy, and I guess you are as well. The other participants are to actually discuss this very issue with Will. I know that Will is extremely open for discussion, but first I give the floor to you, Will, and you can just decide how much time that you want to talk uninterrupted. And I'm sure at some point people can't wait to start ask questions, and we let you know. And but let us first know how long that you would like to talk, without interruptions, so that you can introduce your topic.
So thank you, Jan. So actually, everyone, you're welcome to ask questions throughout. I don't need to. I don't need to kind of get so far, and then we'll start talking. I actually prefer to have conversations. And so Jan did a really good job of kind of teeing up what our research project with the FAR is. And I'm gonna narrow our focus a bit today. It's still the broad question about commercialism, but I'd sent to Alexandra sort of a pitch for today's talk, and I want to focus on one specific set of analyses and one specific sort of area that we're like discussing some theory around quality control, which I think is actually pretty timely and probably something that for many of you in the audience that you're thinking about and kind of wrestling with yourselves. Um, and so what I think I will do is I will go ahead and get started. But as we go, if you do think of any questions or if you have anything that you'd like to ask, please feel free. I've got you up over on this other screen here, and so I should be able to see you with your hands raised as we go. Um, so with that, I do want to just start by giving a bit of caution. Jan knows this. I've been working with the data. The analyses I'll share today are preliminary in nature. Some measures I haven't had a chance to fully put together. Some of the merging of the data sets is not yet complete, and I have not had a chance, unfortunately. I'll only touch on this to kind of look at the survey data we have. So we actually have a sort of a mixed approach. We have some what we call archival data, and then we've also conducted a survey as well. And so there'll be some interesting insights from the survey. I'll actually highlight in my talk today some areas where I think the survey might be better suited to provide some insights, but I don't have, unfortunately, analyses yet around the survey. So I wanted to kind of right up front be clear about that there might be some refinements to the analysis after today's talk, and so I just wanted to kind of head that off. But I do think there's some interesting things we can start to talk about today. Some things that we can see already in the data that I think might be of interest to everyone in the audience. So with that caveat out of the way, as I said, my big question today is going to be kind of centered around a recent thing that I'm seeing from regulators and from critics of the profession, which is almost this insinuation like, are audit firms or auditors out of control? Right. And so what are we really seeing them say? And I do want to be fair. I think that this question maybe 3, 4, 5 years ago was really being discussed as sort of a red light, that there really seems to be some serious systematic problems. I'll show you some more recent comments from the AFM and PCAOB. So the AFM in 2020 even is saying, quality safeguards are critical to audit quality, right? So, there needs to be some structure inside of the firm, the audit firm itself, right, to ensure that audits are conducted in such ways to be in accordance with applicable auditing standards to achieve high audit quality, which is, one of the most important things, outcome-based, right, of auditing. And just so you know, this is not just a Netherlands only issue. I'll go ahead and share from across the pond. Here in the US, similar comments and sentiments, even more recently from PCOB, talking about, and I do this in my auditing class here at University of Illinois. I'll show the students one of the first few weeks of the semester. I'll actually plot over time, the frequency of audit deficiencies that PCB lists in their Part 1 findings for the U.S. filers. And it's a huge number, right? So for any given Big Four firm, there just seems to be all these deficiencies, and so continued area of concern in particular around control, right? And so that's actually something that is kind of behind the scenes. It's not really publicly disclosed very often in the U.S., but they say that sort of the issues around account balances are things that they find are driven in large part by problems that are systemic inside of the audit firms. Those are usually privately held. We don't actually get to observe them very often. And so, the PCOB is talking about, hey, there seems to be something maybe inside the firms that still needs to be refined or improved upon as well. And this also kind of gets, media attention, right? So it's these watchdogs are looking, and then we see that, in the U.S. context, KPMG Korea is cited for quality control failures. So the Wall Street Journal, they're covering this. And that investors, it's being covered by the media, investors are really pushing back that this is a problem. In fact, the IAG, again, this is a U.S. Sort of example or anecdote. The IAG is kind of pushing the PCAOB. Hey, you've been talking for a long time about audit quality indicators. Again, something I know the AFM continues to focus on as well. And we think that if you're tackling that, you really should be tackling quality control at the same time, right? And you should be tackling what the issues are inside of firms, how they can achieve high quality, how they can maintain consistency across audit engagements, to help us as the ultimate consumers of the assurance service, right? To help us feel comfortable, to have trust in the disclosures that are being assured in the first place, right? So there seems to be sort of this tone, and I do want to be, careful here a bit. I don't want to overstate sort of the AFM and the PCB's what I perceive as their recent sentiment, because those comments I shared with you on the previous slide, if you kind of look at the broader speeches that I pulled those from, they do start by saying we acknowledge that we've seen some improvement in these areas, right? So that they're saying that they're seeing some improvements, but then they continue to come back to the same comments and criticisms about that there seems to be potential problems and that there still needs to be improvements. And so that's all well and good, but as they kind of talk about these things, actually looking at the regulator comments or even looking at press coverage, right, where the term quality control shows up and people are talking about this construct, this concept of quality control, it's fair to ask, what is quality control, right? So I'm actually going to turn this over to all of you. And I see, Jan, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. Before you go into quality,
yeah.
So there's more or less an accusation from the regulator, right? That something systemic is going on that would lead to quality issues that might impact quality issues. A question that I have is to what extent, from a research point of view, is that accusation supported, or is it more like an impression, a sentiment, as you call it?
So I would say, Jan, that I don't believe they're being able to point currently to sort of systematic evidence. So I'm actually going to talk about sort of like the history of I'm going to call it the quality control inside of audit firm literature. And so we are drawing from studies that are even in like the management journals and other sort of disciplines inside of business that have thought about this issue for decades. And as we'll talk about again, I'll come back to this in just a few slides, right? Quality control around professions is a difficult thing to kind of even measure. And so, so Jan, to your point, I don't think that they've got a lot of evidence. The PCB would say that their best evidence is on their risk-based assessments, right? So they do a risk-based sampling approach of audit engagements for public accounting firms, for publicly traded company audits. And they say the deficiencies we see here give us, pause and express concern about quality control, but that's not a representative sample of all engagements, right, across an audit firm. And so that's how compelling the evidence is. It's an open question. I think we are in a position to provide some sort of more robust evidence about this issue. And so we'll talk about that today.
Okay, but because one thing that sometimes these regulators compare auditors with is the extent to which to compare auditors with let's say pilots. And they would say, well, if pilots would make as many mistakes, right, we would have more accidents than we actually observe. So there must be something wrong. And I'm not sure what you think about that comparison. I have an opinion. I was actually curious to hear what is your comparison. I mean, if you hear that comparison,
yes,
I don't think I would be very interested. What is your view on that? Because that is what we are often compared to, why the profession is often compared with, right? And if they wouldn't make so many mistakes, right, much more planes would crash.
Well, so there's a couple interesting things I'd love to touch on there. So one is I got my PhD from the University of Florida. And so, you probably know Paul Madsen at the University of Florida. He's an associate professor there. He was a brand new assistant when I got there. And so Paul Madsen, if any of you ever get a chance to kind of look him up and some of his work, he actually, one of his first and I think biggest papers he's written, he actually tried to look at all professions. Right? He had a fundamental question. He asked the accounting profession. People talk about standards and, are there enough standards and how good are the standards? Let me step back. Let me zoom back a bit and ask a fundamental question about, is the accounting profession, relative to other professions, is it kind of what you'd expect in terms of the amount of standards and standardization? What he found actually, and so there's a really cool picture in his paper, he actually shows accounting is like this outlier, right? Compared to like rocket scientists and just like engineers and other professions, we look like we're way too standardized relative to these other folks. And so, when you talk about sort of, things like standards are meant to, maintain professionalism, enhance quality, keep the profession in good standing, make sure audits are done in the right way, right? And so, these comparisons across professions, it's actually interesting because already I would argue there's empirical evidence that the accounting profession is really trying to kind of do these things to head off these problems. To the pilot example, I don't know that's a perfect analogy, right? So my response would be a couple things. One, there are actually sort of, I think, more tangible things in terms of sort of flying an aircraft and in terms of the control systems on the craft and whether or not they're functioning, diagnostics you can take that are more objective, right? And so it's a bit easier to maintain the quality of the aircraft and support systems around the pilot. Whereas, and I think this will always be true, frankly, this is potentially a different conversation. For auditing, what's the real value of the audit? It's the judgment of the person, right? And so, at the end of the day, how do you like regulate that? How do you homogenize something that's actually heterogeneous, right? No two clients are perfectly identical. And so, there has to be some opportunity for judgment. And we have to accept that as a result of that, right, there could be some potential for error, right, on the part of the person making the judgment. And so that would be my response to those that kind of use the pilot as the sort of the reference group to auditors, is that there's some very important distinctions in institutional detail, I think, that make that. I don't know, Jan, what are your thoughts? What do you think about that?
I think that the comparison fail, and for also things that you've been referring to, right? I mean, the extent to which you can actually tell what to do is much more driven by technology and by physics than it is in accounting, right? Where the judgment indeed is such an important factor, and thus the likelihood that you make a mistake in making that judgment. So yeah, that would be my view. There's actually on this there's two comments made. Will, one is made by Andrew. He says quality has definitely improved compared to how things were back in the 90s. But if failure rates are the same or increasing, might it be that the expectations have grown commensurate with the increasing standards? So the standards have increased, like where you already referred to,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe then it looks like as if more mistakes are being made.
Yeah. So let me try to make sure I have. So the question about sort of this overall sentiment that quality is better, right,
Yeah.
from the 90s to now, but
sorry.
The expectations have changed, right? This is actually a fundamental issue that auditing academics are always wrestling with, and I think this is actually true for, again, our conversation today will draw from sort of the broader field of the business literature, especially the management science side of things. And so, Jan, I know managerial is kind of your forte. And so, for any professional, some scholars and academics have put forward that the only real measure of quality is actually sort of like a customer satisfaction, right? Now, in auditing, who's the actual customer? That's the interesting dynamic about auditing, right? Where client management is kind of the person that leads sort of the day-to-day. They're the ones interacting, but really the consumers, I would argue, are a broader set of stakeholders. And so the question here about 90s to now, and sort of the expectations are ratcheting up, that gets back to a fundamental issue of the expectations gap. And I actually think that we're still seeing efforts by the profession, by regulators, to try and address this expectations gap. In particular, I like to point to the expanded auditor reporting initiatives. Right, so we've seen this in the last decade, UK, US, other markets, where we're trying to have the auditors open up the black box. Right, what is it you do? Where are you really focused? Help me as a consumer of the report, which used to just be one page. Right, help me understand what you did, what you're paying attention to. Maybe it'll help me understand what I should be thinking about, whether it's as an equity investor with my valuation or a creditor thinking about a lending decision or so forth. And so I think that's fair. I think it's fair that maybe expectations have been ratcheting up over time, and maybe we're not seeing an improvement simply because the expectations gap has changed. I actually would love to see someone try to kind of get at that. I'm not aware of any study that's longitudinal that looks over time that could tell us if that's the case. I think that probably if I were to try and tackle that question right now, I would probably have to conduct a survey analysis. And I need to survey some folks that have been in the practice or have sat in the C-suite for decades and get their perceptions of how things might have changed over time. I think that would be a great first step to try and test that. I don't think we have data on that, but I think your intuition has some merit. And I'd be interested to try and understand or think about that. But I think that might be true. I also think that if you think about the early 2000s, and certainly in the 2010s in the Netherlands, the sort of the spotlight on accounting issues and accounting failures and things, and how the AFM kind of reacted in the early 2010s, and sort of things that came out of the different initiatives there. Even looking back in the early 2000s in the US, different types of things. The UK recently, what is it? They're getting rid of their prior regulator for the audit profession. They're getting a new one in place. So expectations might be ratcheting up. I think that's a fair question, and so that might actually also be driving sort of the continued push about quality control, and also questions around how can we try to put things in place, frameworks in place to across audit engagements maintain high quality. And so, I'm someone who likes to acknowledge that there's space to potentially do that. But there are challenges because of auditing's unique features. And then the second question that we had, I will definitely get that paper and post in the chat later this session. We want auditors to be. Yeah. Okay. Great. Excellent. Thank you. The idea about standardizing so no one's a maverick, right? And so I'll say that I'm going to give the profession some credit here, and I think there's actually been studies in the Journal of Management, Academy of Management Review, among other really good journals that are out there that have looked at the profession. I'm even going to say in the 1990s, right? Early 1990s, early 2000s. Some of these were qualitative in nature, right? So field studies, going out, talking to people, understanding how the institution works, like getting inside the institution. But the data that came out of those works was, by and large, that professionals oversee professionals, right? And so I'm getting a bit ahead of myself in my conversation, my talk today. But the idea about Mavericks, well, that was always a concern, right? But the party that was always in charge of maintaining quality inside the audit firm, that the governance function was the partners, right? So it's a unique feature of audit firms that the partner is both sort of an agent and a principal, right? But the idea about standardizing, there were always issues about someone being sort of an outlier within the partnership. But I think the partnership itself, subjected them to sort of periodic review. There was internal inspections, all these things that we're going to talk about today, right, to try and address those potential mavericks or outliers. And I'll talk about this today too. There's this long-standing economic theory, and I think it fits the audit context really well. The tournament theory, right? So, and you talk to practitioners, you'll see scholarly work in this area. Audit firms are often described as sort of being organized in sort of suiting itself to the tournament theory of promotion. And so that then says that skilled people rise, right? So you rise because you demonstrate some attributes that are desirable. And so presumably, for the most part, mavericks are people that don't fit firm practice and would be not aligned with, sort of the firm focus on quality, should not rise to the level of partner. Having said all that, when we get to sort of what firms are doing around quality control, we're going to touch on some things firms are doing that I think firms are trying to figure out what is homogeneous, what could be standardized, right? What pieces can we pull out of the audit engagement and just have one sort of team do, right? And then we know that's consistent across clients. And then what we're leaving to the core audit team is just the things that are client specific, that require their judgment and understanding and knowledge. Did I get sort of everyone? I think so. So I actually want to ask the group a quick question, which is, when I say the word quality control, what do you think it is? Now you can either feel free to raise your hands, and you can join us in kind of chat, or you can post it in the chat here as well. Just kind of curious what that term means to you. I like to have interactive sessions. So,
can I give it a try?
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
So the way that I look at it is that in my view, the ultimate user is actually the people who are stakeholders, right? And
right.
And the stakeholders, they somehow must be better off if the auditor has looked into the financial statements of that particular firm in which they are interested, in which they have a stake. So for whatever decision that they are making, right, it must be the case that once the auditor has looked at it, that it is likely that they get better information than in cases where the auditor had not looked at it, right? And that can mean that the firm just made a better, that did their best to make the report because they knew that an auditor would be looking at it, or that they actually forced the firm to make changes into their financial statements when questions were raised by the auditors. So, in my view, in the end, right, quality control is to make sure that that is the case. That either firms are, that the quality of the audit is such that either firms do not feel inclined to make mistakes and do their best actually to present, financial statements that are consistent, or that if mistakes are in the financial statements, that the audit firm makes sure that the auditors are actually going to find these mistakes with a higher likelihood.
Right. So
there's two aspects. There's two aspects, right? So
yeah. So you're actually talking about you're talking about the co-production issue, right? So
yeah.
Because auditing is a service and it relies on the client, right? The client is basically the starting point. They prepare their books and records, and then the auditor comes in and examines them. And so quality control, it's a bit more challenging because you can talk about sort of the qualities inside of the client, right? And that drives potentially the outcome the audit itself. What I'm seeing in the comments, so thank you everyone. I'm seeing lots of good responses here. One of the through lines I'm seeing a lot is things around standards, right? So, consistent with standards. So Niles is, I think, was the first one to kind of respond, and talking about sort of a framework, ensuring that the engagement, right, is done consistent, performed within a framework, within an applicable framework. So seeing standards, that the idea about people, right, and different perspectives being integrated to ensure sort of good oversight over the judgments exercised in within the audit itself. This is actually really good, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So, the sort of classic economic and from like the industrial organization literature sort of idea, when we first started seeing the term quality control, it was always done talking about manufacturing, right? So, the idea about total quality management really, it started with, and I'm going to give the auto industry some credit here. So I think a lot of this kind of came out of sort of auto industry. You've got sort of even today sort of legacy term around like Toyota's total quality management system as well. And so in a tangible production process, it's like monitoring to determine that the thing that comes off the end of the line has desired attributes, to be consistent with the desired quality. And so like you could see like Apple rolls off an iPhone and then another one and another one and another one. But then this one comes off. That was not the same, right? It doesn't have the attributes of the previous smartphones. It's a flip phone. Who uses those still? And so that's where the sort of in the process, kind of identifying these things that are not, it's not producing the right good in this context. So it's not of the appropriate quality, right? It's not the attributes that are desired. But as everyone's talking about, right, in an intangible production process, it's the process, right? And so I really liked all the responses that talked about standards. Because if you really think about auditing standards, what are they talking about? They're talking about the act of doing. Right? So auditing standards understands that auditing is a process. It's interactive. It's about going and talking to the client. It's about going and performing procedures. And it's ultimately about exercising judgment, right? And so if I wanted to try and use my analogy again about like sort of rolling off an assembly line, so you've got let's say we wanted several people to consider a specific set of facts and circumstances, a specific account inside of a client. So the first person comes out and they think a certain way, and then the next person has the same thoughts, and the next person, and the next person, and then somebody has a different way of seeing, right? Now, here's the trouble. Right? So as we talked about today, is that bad? Is that bad? Perhaps our person with the red thoughts, while different, has brought a new perspective. As someone said, actually, in the responses, it was sorry, so I'm going to give credit. Is Yasmin, right? So the idea about having different thoughts or perspectives might be beneficial. We know that there's a lot of auditing literature looking at like, sort of behavioral judgment and decision-making issues. This literature is rich, and one of the through lines that we see is people have trouble with contradictory evidence. Right? Auditors have trouble with contradictory evidence, but that's actually more of a broad human issue too, and that there needs sometimes to be sort of mechanisms to kind of help. It's helpful to be reminded, for example, be prompted, give weight, give consideration to contradictory evidence, right? Include it in your memo, your documentation at the end about you saw these things and then you ultimately decided X, even given Y. And so, what is quality control? It's in an intangible service context. It's harder. And so what we've seen, there's lots of studies that have looked at the audit profession. And by and large, they've talked about sort of the evolution of these practices, and it's professionals controlling professionals, as I said a few moments ago. Right? It's actually, there's been studies that kind of explain why audit firms are partnerships. Right? Because you could ask yourself fundamentally, why aren't audit firms corporations? Why are they partnerships? And it's a longstanding thing consistent with this theory that because of the way in which audits are done, and because of the nature of auditing and how hard it can be, right, to standardize controls, having a partnership, having that structure facilitates governance and oversight so that senior partners can kind of observe what's going on. They can kind of monitor other professionals, right? And they can use their own judgment to kind of see, again, go back to the Maverick comment, right? They can identify people that are not consistent, right? They're not delivering quality in the same way or thinking about things in the way in which the firm views sort of, whether it's fundamental things like client acceptance and continuance, so like the risk even in the beginning, right? Or how a person designs the audit engagement, how they go about conducting their procedures. But here's where, and this is again pulling in another comment from earlier, where things are changing and the profession is evolving, and that makes sense, right? So business changes, tools change, the context of business changes, and so audit firms are actually, there's a number of papers that are saying, if we look at how firms are being organized and sort of the processes inside of the firms, are they becoming more bureaucratic? Are they becoming more like a corporation, right? And a couple of things I can point to are really the centers for excellence. So that's a term that's in the U.S. And I'm not talking about offshoring here, which is another avenue that firms are going through. I don't know. I feel like that's fallen out of favor a bit, in recent years. But sort of the centers for excellence, as I understand it, and we actually had a person seeking a job, so a person on the job market this year, come in just last week, and her dissertation is on it's an experiment, and it's actually I thought it was super interesting and very timely for my talk today. So she actually did an experiment around sort of like having work done by a center for excellence, and how do members of the core audit team sort of view that work, and how do they kind of um, how do they react to the work? How do they are they happy to just sort of sign off on what the Center for Excellence does? And what about if that Center for Excellence, has lots of follow-up questions to the client, right? So does that potentially have some sort of impact on how they view the Center for Excellence? And so what she actually, to me, these are not her work; these are mine from her study. But one of the things I think she was really studying is frictions in quality control, right? So one thing that I think is interesting, and I'm just pointing this out as something for all of us to consider as we go forward, is when we see big changes, and to me, trying to move from sort of this centuries old organizational strategy, right? Professionals monitor professionals, it's, the partners on like an annual basis, sort of reviewing work, inspecting work, thinking about how people are doing their jobs, to trying to standardize things, trying to create more objective measures in annual performance reviews, right? All of these things. What might that mean, right? In terms of how quality control works, especially if you've got sort of the prior way of doing things, and then you're introducing a new way, might there be frictions in how quality control works? She actually documents that for some of the participants, they sort of like disregarded the Center for Excellence, right? Even though there's no reason to. And she even documented in her post-experiment questionnaire, like they couldn't really articulate a valid reason that they discounted the work of the Center for Excellence, right? It was just that they didn't do things the way that they used to do them, so they don't like it, right? And so that's something that I just wanted to kind of point out today, as it stands in the current context, right? And I didn't make these terms up, right? So you can go to the AFM or the PCAOB, for example, and kind of see what they talk about as sort of these overarching factors that drive quality, right? The quality control mechanisms inside of audit firms. And it starts with a fundamental thing. So assurance can't be valuable if the third party isn't actually independent. So independence and objectivity. This one, especially, and as I'll talk about when I get to sort of the data in our study, for the large accounting firms, they've got this non-compliance system in place, right? They can sit down and on a periodic basis make sure that fairly straightforward things aren't happening, that audit partners don't have financial interest in clients, right? So independence, objectivity, it's harder to control sort of actually the mental side, the bias side of things, but certainly the appearance side of things, there are things you can do. Personnel management is a big one, starting with hiring the right people, retaining them, but then also deploying them, right? How do you set them out on different engagements? Deciding what clients to work with, and then the engagement performance side and monitoring, right? So engagement performance has a lot of different levers that the firm can kind of toy with to try and make the process high quality with the objective that the outcome, right, is high quality. And the monitoring is kind of coming after the fact and thinking about what was done and how it went. If we actually look at sort of specific things that are highlighted, again, I'm going to go ahead and I'll go backwards one slide. I'm going to go ahead and for purposes of our paper, we're not really looking at the independent side because in talking to firms in the Netherlands, for example, but I think it's also true in the US, the incidents of like someone violating the independence rules are very rare, right? So if I was to create like a variable and try to like compute the mean rate of violations, it's close to 0%. So sort of measures that we could have there's not a lot to kind of study in that space. Acceptance and continuance, we're picking up after they've decided to work with the client, right? I'll talk about risk, but that's not really something I'm going to focus on. So, in our paper, we are going to look at these different areas of quality control, right? And so, if we think about what's going on inside of firms, there's lots of things driving sort of the personnel side, including development of specialists, the training that's going to be given to these people before they even get onto the engagement, right? So what annual trainings do they have? What might you be sending them to in advance of their next engagement? And then moving into like the engagement team, right? The actual performance. And this is where that Center for Excellence can come in because you can actually say, hey, Center for Excellence, go ahead and do the audit of accounts receivable. Right? You scope it, you pick your procedures, you collect your evidence, and then you document in a memo for the rest of us what you found, which is, I think, what's going on inside of certainly the larger firms right now is they're doing more of that. Who are you bringing in to consult, right? National office, and then what mandatory procedures, perhaps mandatory consultation in the actual engagement itself is required. And then, I didn't actually even list it, but like hot reviews. So do you have a very senior partner that's actually, in real time looking over shoulders and kind of providing feedback about decisions that are made? But then after the fact, the firm has their own what we call cold reviews, right? So the internal reviews after the fact, after it's all done. But we also know that these engagements are subject to peer review from a peer audit firm. They're also examined by the regulator. And I know in the Netherlands it's not the U.S., right? But litigation, right? Those types of things, that risk can also be viewed as a sort of a quality control mechanism, right? As well. I'll kind of ask the group at large, given what I'm showing here about different specific actions or activities inside of these different broad categories, what do you view as potentially the most important quality control issue? Right. So do you think it's, just training? Do you think it's the centers for excellence are sort of like homogenizing things or, trying to standardize across engagements? What do you think? Okay, so seeing sort of time allocation is one thing. And then I'm going to say the sort of the lack of clear understanding. Right? I'm actually going to kind of fold that under sort of like standardized processes here, right? So the idea that that there might be not clear guidance, clear firm guidance, maybe in terms of how to move forward with an issue or topic. What we focus on in our paper is predominantly time allocation, right? But what's interesting for us, I think, is we kind of look at how people are allocating their time. In doing so, we actually are capturing training, And we're also capturing down here sort of the engagement of consultants, consulting on the different audit engagements. And then we also have some measures of sort of this after the fact, these ex post quality measures as well. So conceptually, right, this goes back several decades sort of in the literature. When people were thinking about professionals and sort of, how they how they go about their business, right? And then focusing specifically on auditing. They said, okay, first and foremost, there's only 24 hours in a day. So if we talk about auditing and we think about their time allocation as an important consideration and how people are allocating their time, to the extent the firm can guide that, right, and set expectations for how they should allocate their time, that's a quality control initiative. So we've got an individual, they say they're going to devote half their day. So let's say it's busy season, right? Half their day to work. Well, what do they do with that work, right? So if this is fixed, if they're only going to give us this much time, half the pie, to work, if they're only spending so much time doing core audit work because they've got client relationship management responsibilities, and so what does that mean? What are the implications there in terms of audit quality, the service quality, right? So there's this, I kind of characterize it as like a trade-off theory. There's this existing, long-standing theory that some critics, some high-profile critics of the profession, kind of points to that says, by construction, if you're doing more client development activity, right, and this can be very clear things like writing new proposals, but also folded within this is the CRM, the client relationship management aspect of things, right? So it's going out, it's trying to build relationships, right? It could be either with the long-term purpose of cross-selling other services or just trying to enrich that relationship to maintain that relationship going forward. These are not things that are pertinent to the actual audit itself. Right? The more that you're doing that by construction, the less time you're devoting to auditing. And so that's, the concern is, okay, well, if this gets too far, you're not putting enough hours in to actually do the audit. And so then the audit quality is going to suffer. Or another, stream of theory here talks about the more attention that you give to, say, client development here, that might set a tone where then trickle down to the rest of the engagement team. Everyone's thinking that client relationship management is more important, and perhaps audit work becomes less important to everyone. And so coming out of this sort of theory, there are these kind of broader sweeping categorizations about auditors. And again, specifically thinking about, now Naz is asking actually about an important question. I'm gonna talk about this in just a second about why does it have to be one or the other, right? So the trade-off theory says it's one or the other. The more commercialism by construction, the less professionalism, right? And so if we talk about auditor types, it's in the last 2 decades, we've actually seen a shift. And the literature has started to acknowledge that, in fact, professionalism and commercialism don't have to be, these disparate ends of just one continuum. And so instead, we can actually sort of plot people along sort of 2 dimensions. And so I'm going to start with, if we're going to plot along sort of like a 2-dimensional space, I have to acknowledge that this cell theoretically exists. So it might be the case that you have some subset of people that we would call unmotivated auditors. Now, in our context, what I'm saying is they have no motivation to be a good professional, and they have no motivation to succeed commercially. Do any of those people actually exist in practice? I can't think that they would. I mean, that's, again, the tournament theory, practically speaking, these are individuals that just wouldn't have chosen to be in the profession, or certainly would be counseled out very early, right? But I'm just acknowledging that that's part of the space. So what actually would the trade-off theory say? It would say that we want idealized auditors. So what we're looking for is folks that wind up over here, where if I were to draw this sort of at the bottom here, they're high on professionalism. They are, very professionally oriented. They care deeply about adhering to standards. Lots of investment in technical training, right, and de-emphasizing sort of the commercial aspect of things. Now, the other end of the spectrum, then, that's been argued in the trade-off theory is that over here, these are folks that are instead very self-interested. They're very, very focused on short-termism. They want to make engagements profitable. They want to try to, they're focused on sort of their wealth generation from, managing their practice. And they're not, on this space, they're not very interested. They're not really focusing on the professional obligation, thinking more broadly about stakeholders and the, larger social role that auditors serve, right, in sort of capital markets. What recent literature has acknowledged is there's likely actually what's happening is you've sort of got people that you can plot dots all around here, and a lot of people might wind up over here in what we're going to call the entrepreneurial auditor space. And so these are individuals that are actually going to probably score high, both sort of their professional identification and also in sort of the commercial motivation as well. And so really the question becomes, it's not as straightforward as I'm more commercial, therefore I'm less professional. The real question is just, is more commercialism, all else equal, problematic, right? And so what we are going to do is actually look at some data. Now, when I show you these distributions, I'm going to start by saying something important. So I actually don't want you to focus on one of the cells because I don't think I'm measuring the unmotivated auditor at all. Okay, so I'm going to show you some data, and it's going to look like I have a whole bunch of people in an unmotivated auditor cell. I don't think. I'm only measuring like directors or senior managers and partners. So these are individuals that have been in the tournament for years and have risen very high inside the firm, right? And I actually think this is what I said earlier about the survey data, and I need to get through it and kind of put it together. The survey data actually will help us measure sort of the actual mentality or perception and focus of the individuals. Whereas what I'm going to show you is how they're spending their time. But how I'm comparing them to each other, right? So when I go to this table here, if you look sort of no, there's quite a number of them. But here's what's going on inside the table. All I've done is I've done a median splits on the amount of time they spend in what we call our commercial activities and the amount of time that they spend in their training, their learning and education. So somebody has to be in the bottom half, right, along both measures. So I don't really want us to focus on this number because this is just saying that this group relative to their peers is less. What that doesn't mean to me, and I don't want us to interpret it this way, I'm not saying it's evidence of this, right? I'm not saying that. It's likely if I actually plotted them, they're somewhere in these three cells, right up here. So instead, what I want to focus on is a few other things I think we can glean from this, right? So first of all, look at this, right? 134 individuals out of 494 usable observations that I had to run some initial preliminary analysis. So like what, a quarter of them are high on both, right? High on both. And this is even having them be like the reference group is other seasoned, experienced auditors. And we still got people that are driving towards being sort of at the high end of both, right? So that, I think, to me is actually pretty powerful evidence of this idea of the entrepreneurial auditor, right? And yes, we do see people that are, yes to commercial, but no to training. There's a large number of those. Yes to training, no. There's a large number of those. So I think what we're seeing is sort of that there is a cross section of people, some that will just be naturally higher maybe on one dimension than the other, but a number that are high on both. Right? Now, unless, like, again, as a careful archivalist, we want to try to triangulate with multiple measures. So an alternative would be to use mentorship as sort of a proxy or an operational measure around, sort of the professional obligation, right? Again, this goes back to this draws from the management literature, thinking about what it means to be a professional, right? So actually, so Elena, I do actually have that. I'm sorry, I'm trying to keep up with the questions. Will idealized auditors survive? I just saw that question. I think that they will. And I wonder long term. So this is actually just an aside. I wonder if those folks might more often gravitate towards sort of quality control functions, right? So becoming a partner and maybe sitting in national office. However, this is just anecdotal, but I talked to a handful of folks in the Netherlands as part of this project, unstructured interviews, just to get some context and background and understanding. I met one or two folks I would categorize as more on the idealized auditor side. They were partners, right? So they still get promoted. One person made it very clear that they really dislike going to lunch and dinners and all those things, right? That, like, I really would rather just do my job, right? I just want to do my job. But they basically said, it's a part of the role. I have to do this. Right? I have to do it. I like, okay, I get that, right? Sometimes I don't want to go to dinner, right? I understand. But so I think there's space for them, even as things continue to change. And I think there's some real value in having those individuals inside of a firm, right? Again, you want people with different perspectives, I think, right? Inside of a sort of a vibrant firm. Sorry, I just want to make sure I was catching up with the questions. Regulatory changes. That's a good question. As far as driven by regulatory changes, I think that might require sort of a longer sort of time series. I don't know that I have that. I certainly can. I do have a few years, so I can kind of do it by year potentially as sort of a refinement going forward about changing or evolving over time, and that might be worth actually exploring. Millennials is idealized auditors. That's a really good question. I don't know if I have age for everybody, but to the extent I have age, I could try to parse that out, and that might be an interesting thing to think about as I go forward. And so, certainly, right, just trying to sort of explore or really use the data to gather more insights. Those are some really interesting things I will definitely think about in my refinements of the analysis. Again, circling back to what I was talking about just a moment ago. So just trying to triangulate. So I picked an alternative, sort of category of time that we have in our data set, which is mentorship. And again, the reason why I think this measure is appealing and useful is that mentorship, it's out there in the literature, right? That's sort of someone that's sort of takes their profession and has high esteem for their profession, wants to ensure the profession is in good standing, and therefore takes it upon themselves to help the next generation, right? Also understand the importance of the profession and succeed and do a good job. And so if I split on time in this way, we actually see a really similar pattern. We actually see more people. So just raw numbers, right? 134 versus 165, right? So we even see more that actually would be categorized as both scoring relatively higher on sort of their commercial effort or focus and higher on sort of their mentorship effort and focus. But still, we do see some folks in both of these in the off diagonal, right? Falling into those other two where they're scoring high on one but not the other. But overall, I think this provides some sort of descriptive support for the idea that, it's not going to be that there's just these two extremes, right? I'm really not seeing that in the data, that you're either really commercial or you're really professional. That's not what we're seeing. And that's consistent with the emerging theory, sort of the continued discussion within the literature about, what it means to be an audit professional in particular or a professional in general, as these firms are undergoing continuous change, right, as they're evolving. So all of this is driving towards, all right, quality, right? And one of the big focuses in the paper is sort of looking at time allocation, which is, again, one of the things we talked about as a quality control. and specifically focusing in on the relative amount of time in commercial activity. And ultimately, a lot of this is focused on the outcome of the audit. So at the end of the day, how good was it? Right? What is the outcome of the audit? We actually have a few different quality measures. I'm going to focus on reviews. And again, I just want to highlight, I think those measures, I'll be able to boost the number once some more data comes in and you have a bit more power in these tests. But I want to share with you what I've been able to test so far in this space. And so we're saying, based on sort of the longstanding theory and the criticism about engaging in commercial effort, that a main effect is commercial effort will be negatively related to audit quality. That's sort of the theory, sort of the longstanding, and that's consistent with the criticisms and the conjecture by regulators, right? Now, sort of building off of this idea, right? We're going to, include a number of important controls around quality control, fees, risk, and so forth. And then, as I'll circle back to in just a minute, right? Quality control becomes an important thing we consider in our paper specifically. But what drives the audit quality? Well, again, if we're talking about time, it's not just the partner. Right? It's not just what he or she is doing. It's a bigger thing than that. There's a whole team. There's a whole team that is actually doing the work. So again, I'm starting from sort of the trade-off theory contention, which is if the partner is doing less work, right? If he or she is spending more time on client relationship management, who's covering that time that should be theirs, where they're sitting down reviewing, different estimates, they're thinking about fair value, they're, considering and they're planning, whether it's sort of the negotiations about to happen at the end of the audit for, what adjusting entries need to be booked, right? Who's covering this if they're not spending as much time on audit work, right? And so, what we say is, well, there could be a number of players, starting with these people right here, right? So, we could say that this void is filled by senior managers who are still very experienced auditors and could be very good. Right? In an important way, right? Staffing is a big question, right? And just because the partner, he or she, may not be able to devote X number of extra hours to this specific engagement doesn't mean that other very experienced people can't still sit down and give time and attention to different areas. On top of that, we argue that consultations, especially around very technically complex areas, can be really helpful. And so bringing in technical experts, right, can help. And we actually, we kind of point to some literature that talks about, right, individuals that maybe are relatively more commercially oriented. And what I mean by that is they exert more commercial effort. We're drawing on the sort of the theory that the more time you commit to something, the more importance you place on it. To Jan, to your point, we actually asked this question about, is it the auditor themselves kind of going out and getting the client, or are they being assigned? It's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of both. And so we do think that there is, and we can actually, we've talked to them there, and they do put time, like some of the build time that we see that's in our measure is on proposals for new clients, right? A decent amount of it is on the client relationship management component, though. That's an important thing that we've tried to make clear in the paper. Is that this measure is picking up both things. But there is some idiosyncratic sort of the person is driving to some extent their book. I think probably my suspicion, I don't know that this is something I could say definitively from my semi-structured interviews. My suspicion is that maybe for higher profile clients, for big clients, there's probably more care by the firms as to who is on that account. right? But certainly for smaller engagements, I think that can be driven a lot of times by the person, by the individual auditor. I also asked, is time spent a good indicator of assurance? Is it not just about the judgment? That's a fair point. So I think on average, there's a lot of evidence that like the inverse. So when people are subject to time pressure and they feel constrained and they can't devote sufficient time to exercise care, there's a lot of evidence that judgments are worse. So I think that it's often kind of put forward that more time on average can be good. I will acknowledge that we probably can think of different examples where just putting more time into something may not be beneficial, may actually be detrimental to judgment and decision making. And certainly, to your point is well taken. It's about the quality of the judgment, and some people might be more efficient than others, and that's fine. So here we're dealing mostly with on average effects, and so that's sort of how we're grounding our thinking here, and we're kind of drawing that in from prior literature. But certainly, I'm sure we can identify individuals that are just better, faster, more efficient. That's probably true. So then, the other thing we're kind of drawing from here, the second part of the slide, is that auditors that maybe are known to be more active, commercially active individuals, a couple of things might be true about them. So one thing might be because they are potentially then drivers of the commercial success of the business, they might have just more power and therefore the ability to get better people. And in our semi-structured interviews, we learned from a few of the partners we talked to, there is some of that, right? I mean, the partnership has to get together and leadership has to decide, their requests, I want so-and-so on my team. Should we give so-and-so to that team, or do we actually want to put them somewhere else? Right. So there's a potential power dynamic about being able to pull certain individuals, right, to be really good, technically proficient people onto the team. But we also draw in some behavioral theory that says that these individuals that exert more commercial effort and have more of their identity within the firm kind of aligned to that might be more willing to ask for help, right? Just a generic idea of just they're more willing to ask for help along a dimension that you don't see yourself as having to be like, I am the expert, right? You're more comfortable saying, I'm okay asking Jan to come in and help me because I don't think it's a failure on my part to ask for help in that context. And so we actually said,
in management control, that is part of the entrepreneurial spirit, right? The fact that you actually look out for help, and that people on the other hand are ready to help you, right, within the same firm, is actually part of the entrepreneurial spirit. Very much so.
So that's something that maybe we should play up a bit more.
It is Simon's. Bob Simon's work.
Simon's, got it. Okay, I'll make a note of that. So we actually come back to our hypothesis, right? Our main effect about commercial effort and audit quality. We say, well, if that's true, what really should be going on? Is it true that audit quality will be on average worse? Maybe what's actually going to happen is something more like this. And so individuals with more effort, right? If they just focus sort of on this path here about a main effect, right? Okay, that could be negative. But we expect that they'll be more likely to rely on quality control. And that should be positively related to audit quality. So then what will the overall effect be? Will it be positive, negative, neutral? And so that's actually in our final analysis, we're going to do this path analysis. And we're going to really test these different links. I've done some initial tests. Now, again, just to remind you, a couple things. One, again, it's preliminary, so this will be subject to refinement, so that caveat. Also, before we start looking at things, the data was anonymized. Right? I can't see who anyone is. I don't want to. And it's been transformed. Why does that matter? I really don't want you to focus on magnitudes because some of the numbers are going to look a little bit odd, but it's because they're transformed. Okay. So I want to talk about things in sort of a relative way today. I want to show you some different stuff and just kind of walk through what we're seeing sort of within this data in sort of a comparative way. Right. So and I apologize. It's a good thing, right? So I can't, right, in my remote environment, I can't like email myself what the output is, and that's not a problem for tables, right? I can manually type that in. I have to figure out a workaround on figures out of Stata with the data. So I took pictures. So I'm sorry these look a little bit funny, but I really like these pictures, and I wanted to show them to you to kind of show you a few things, and I'll try to explain what's going on here. So. Okay, what's going on in this picture? So it's cut off. I'm sorry. So here along the vertical axis, this is the average number of consultations per audit engagement for a given individual. Okay, so we see like a max average of like 6, kind of high per engagement, right? For a partner or a director, down to 0. Some people have no consultations. The the horizontal axis here in this one, I'm plotting it against the amount of hours in the year that were spent specifically on what we call the commercial activities, commercial effort, right? And so what I thought was really interesting is there's not a lot of descriptive support for what I just conjectured, right? I would have expected to see sort of maybe not perfectly linear trend, but some sort of kind of increasing access to more with more commercial effort. I don't really see that here. I said, okay, well, maybe we're really wrong. What about if I plot this instead by a measure that would be more aligned with sort of an emphasis on technical competence, so training? I actually see a really similar pattern, right? So here along the horizontal axis, it's the number of hours that they book to training, L&E, learning and education. Again, average consultations. Still really clustered, right? Down here. And so, okay, all right. So neither one of these seems to be sort of showing like a pattern of sort of increasing access on average to consultations per engagement. Well, I'm just curious. So I just thought, well, okay, what if I kind of look for something that might be a more clear driver of consultation requests? So again, on the left-hand side, I've got sort of the on average consultations. At the bottom now, I've got sort of a rough or a course, my initial course measure of average risk of audit engagements. Okay, now I'm starting to see more of what I would have expected, maybe with my commercialism. It is kind of moving this way, and we're seeing more instances where it's kind of going up as risk goes up. This is not a perfect measure of risk, and I need to think a bit more carefully about it. So generally, when there's risk assessments made, the scales are a bit different across firms. And so, thinking about, for example, when it's qualitative, low versus high. So what I've got right now is I've got a pretty coarse, like sort of low, high categorical variable. So 0 is like there was no real issue. Low, 1, and then high was given a 2. Right. So it's not a terribly precise measure. But I do think it does show us along sort of what you would expect to be sort of a fundamental driver for asking for help, right? Reaching out for consultations, right, which can be time consuming and they're very technically oriented. Right? We are seeing sort of an increase, a little bit of an increase when the risk is higher. And then one last plot for you. So I actually split the sample. So 0 here, this subset, these are the auditors that scored relatively low on commercial effort. And these are the auditors that scored relatively high on commercial effort. Something really interesting to me is that consultations were higher, right, in the low effort, but I actually think that it might be the case that higher risk clients might be kind of clustered in the lower commercial auditors. So let me actually show you some descriptives. So here is my high commercial effort. I did it over two slides, so I'm sorry, do a little bit of toggling here. So if I split on the median, roughly, within my sample, you know, again, don't focus, it's 570, million euros. That's not right. That's not the measure. But what we can kind of see is the client risk is like a 1.4 on average for high commercial effort. If I go over here, it's 1.8. Right? In general, what we're seeing is sort of, it looks like to me, high commercial effort auditors actually seem to have on average like slightly smaller books of business, right? They also seem to have less, if we go, so looking here, 31 versus 36, right? Now, it's more meaningful to actually do a test, so let's just do a t-test of these things. If we look, right, it eyeballed looks different in terms of fees between the two groups. It's not statistically significantly different, but I mean, it looks like they're a little bit different. But risk seems to be more concentrated in our low commercial effort group. Right? And so perhaps something we didn't fully think about was, the riskier clients might be clustered in with individuals that maybe aren't relatively as commercially oriented and they're not exerting as much effort, right? And we also see then that the lower commercial effort is actually associated with more. So the negatives here, right? I'm subtracting the low commercial effort from the high, right? So that's why everything is negative. So actually seeing that on average, consultations are more likely for the low commercial effort group as opposed to the high. And then we don't see any meaningful difference in like annual performance. Right? So they're not worse, right? Nobody's worse than the other one, relatively speaking. They're pretty similar. But we do see something interesting with respect to sort of, so this compliance term is my first measure around these sort of reviews, the outcome reviews. So we see some pretty strong descriptive evidence that the outcome, the audit outcome, is not as good for commercially oriented or commercial effort. Okay, that's great. How about some regressions? Right? So let's actually, so Jan's asking, are low commercial auditors sent to in anticipation of high risk clients? Maybe Jan, right? Maybe that could be something that's happening inside the firms. It's something I need to give more thought to. Again, until I have all the data, right? Until I have everything in there and all of my measures, I'm not going to make a definitive conclusion. But these are sort of preliminary findings that I thought were interesting, and I wanted to share them with you. So let's run some regressions. Right? So what am I doing in these regressions for now? Again, it's not the complete model I showed you a few moments ago, but it's a pretty nice model. So I've got a couple of different important what we viewed as important categories of time. So I've got their commercial effort, training, mentorship, their audit specific hours. Right? So for a given individual, how many audit hours did they book that year for auditing? And then we actually have their time in engagement quality review. Right? So how much time they spent doing the quality control side of things. And then we control for, sort of the book of business, the cross-selling, client risk. Leverage here is not leverage like the debt to equity ratio. It's like engagement leverage. And so this term is important to think about. Higher scores of leverage here are indicative of more seasoned auditor time. Because the numerator in this leverage ratio, it's director and partner time. And then the denominator is everybody, right? So that's staff, seniors, everybody on the engagement. So higher leverage, actually, we would interpret that as being, better, higher quality effort, right? Better people, more skilled people. And then we control for sort of the most complex or the biggest clients, the percentage of OOB engagements in the portfolio. So what do we see? So if I try to figure out and model average consultations as a function of all these variables, not a lot explains it, but interestingly, not something we were specifically focused on, If you are an auditor that seems to, again, with my proxy being training or L&E, learning and education, you're actually less likely to ask for help. That's consistent with the broader theory around sort of help seeking for professionals. It was not what our focus was. Our focus is on the commercial effort side, but this actually is consistent with that theory. Right? It's just a different group. What I thought was particularly interesting, right, is when there's more cross-selling, more likely to consult. So again, almost as if sort of, hey, we know that this might be a situation where these clients would appear to be we might be at greater risk of looking like we're impairing audit quality. So let's go ahead and access quality control more, right? Let's go ahead and access it to ensure quality there, right? And then as I showed you, like the pattern of the results, it holds up in the regression, right? Client risk positively related to accessing quality control, right? So that I thought was really interesting. So another way to try and think about quality control is leverage, right? So it's not just asking for technical experts, but just in general having more seasoned people on the engagement. So let me instead regress leverage on our measures of time or time allocations. Oh, I should clarify. So I actually ran. So why do I have two sets? I'm sorry, I should clarify this. So this left hand side, this first set, that is just like the log transformation of these hours, not scaled by total time booked. The right-hand side, I then scaled each of the subcategories by total time booked. And so, I think this side's the better approach, but I wanted to show it both ways. Right? Does that make sense? Because in both circumstances, it's log transformed, but here I'm actually doing the extra step of scaling by total hours for the individual for the year. So that's why there's two sets of coefficients and two sets of t-stats. So going back to sort of the second way to access quality control. So we've got our time, we've got fees and risk and so forth. Again, I'm not seeing commercial auditors exhibiting a significant, having a significant sort of main effects on leverage choices, right? Trying to maybe have more seasoned people on the engagement. What I do find, and this just makes sense, right? Some evidence that the more time that individual director or partner is putting into audit hours, it's positively related to leverage. Sure, that makes sense. I see that actually for individuals, auditors in our sample with on average higher books of business. So as total audit fees for their book of business are higher, leverage is lower, right? So that to me makes sense too. What's likely happening is we're talking about bigger portfolios, so probably more staff are needed, right, to kind of do the work. And then consultations and leverage are positively related to each other. Right? So consultations are positively associated with engagement leverage as well. So not a lot of support for sort of that channel that we were predicting about accessing quality control. Again, it's early, but I did want to acknowledge that. Okay, all right. So then, what else? What else did you find? Well, how about if I actually focus on sort of that main effect that we talked about? All right. So again, I've got my time measures here, and then some of the core controls that we talked about, like fees, non-fees, risk, and so forth. Pretty strong main effect. Pretty strong main effects of more commercial effort is negatively related to sort of having compliant in terms of external reviews. Incidences of non-compliance in the external reviews are higher. Right? So negative audit quality is what I'm seeing. Sort of a negative effect on audit quality for commercially oriented auditors. I'm not sure what to make of this. Negative relation to the more time that someone spends on engagement quality reviews for other engagements is negatively related to their own quality. I don't know if that's something I need to investigate a bit more. I think, but that was something puzzling that came out of the data, the initial assessment, and then
Andrew suggested that it's overconfidence actually.
It could be. That's a really good point, Andrew, and it's something that we could talk about. There's a lot of literature that talks about that kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, as I think about sort of interpreting these results, like I think about sort of like the oh geez, who is it? It's a 2009 TAR paper, accounting review paper, where they actually sort of plot like tenure and quality, and they show that like quality gets better and better and better, and then it gets worse um, over time towards the tail end. So like if you've been the auditor for 12 or more years, you start to show signs of lower quality again. And so maybe that's what's going on here. But we do find some evidence of sort of this main effect, commercial effort. So that's this cell. One thing I just want to say, I did run the analysis, including interaction terms for respectively consultations and then leverage with the commercial effort measure. The interaction terms are just insignificant. That's not the analysis we were proposing to run. We're going to run a path analysis following Hayes with a bootstrap approach. I just haven't had a chance to run that yet. I think that would be a more robust analysis. This was sort of a first pass, just kind of looking and seeing what the data is telling me with some sort of simple linear OLS sort of regressions. But there's, a lot more to be done in this space. I thought these were pretty interesting. And it's no problem. Please, if you have to go, no problem. Right. But, we can certainly, thank you, Jan, think about, sort of this idea of over time, overconfidence, or is it e-learning? What might be driving sort of some of these interesting findings that, were not the initial focus, but might be worth discussing, certainly in the final paper, to provide additional contribution, right, insights. So what would I say are the key takeaways from sort of what we've done so far and sort of the where the paper is going? I'm going to start with, I don't know that trade-off theory has a lot of support because the distribution doesn't really seem to support that, right? It doesn't seem to be that you've got sort of just two tails of people, right? There's a lot of individuals that are both, high on both, and so I don't know that long-standing theory is as descriptive of sort of the way that the audit profession and professionals work. However, right, it appears that commercial effort is associated on average with lower quality. That's at least the initial takeaway from what we're seeing. And then, interestingly, despite sort of the behavioral theory we're drawing from, we're not seeing commercial effort associated with access to quality control. And so this is going to be something to kind of think about. Again, always careful as an archivist about normative things, but maybe it should be, right? Maybe for these individuals, they should be, trained and coached up to reach out to ask for help, right? They might need to be asking for more help. So with that, and we've had some good questions and comments throughout. I only have a few minutes I know left. Any final questions or comments? I'm happy to kind of talk about anything I've walked through today. Or
please go ahead. We still have a few minutes, so please take this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's all I have in terms of prepared comments for today.
It is a difficult notion to really think about, in terms of how this commercialism is going to affect in the end the quality, right? Because on the one hand, there's the issue that these are probably very seasoned auditors, right? That's why they are also looking into these commercial activities. And probably they are also very good at actually creating trust in clients and potential clients, and for that reason they are set. But then the question is, why are they so talented? Right? Because maybe it is because they are able to ask the relevant questions to clients on their financial statements, right? So it is a very, very complex question to answer, actually. Yeah.
And one thing that we have to be really clear about is, as you're saying, we're focusing on directors and partners and senior managers here. So I'm comparing the high commercial people to other very experienced auditors.
Yes.
Right. So it's all relative to who's your base group, right? Who's your control group. So those are things that we're trying to be really clear in the paper. We'll definitely try to be really clear going forward. Do I think that the audit firm should try to screen? This is a question that comes up in the US. Should you guys be trying to do more of these personality surveys? Should you be trying to figure this out, like how you select in or who selects in to your firms? I'm not sure about that, right? First of all, I think one of the things is at this current state of audit practice, right? I mean, we're hearing a lot, at least in the US, and it might be a bit different in the Netherlands, I'm not sure, about hiring more people outside of accounting. Right? We need more comp sci people, computer science. We need more engineers. ESG is growing, burgeoning. We need engineers. We need environmental engineers. And these are people that might be very different because they selected into a different major in college than an accountant did, right? And an auditor did. I would hesitate right now to start making, if I was running a firm, I would hesitate to start just saying, like, I'm going to try and figure out, on this specific dimension, I'm going to exclude people. Because the truth is, I think they're sort of in a state of flux about what's the knowledge base that the firm needs, like broadly needs. It's a longer term question, Alexandra, right? About whether or not maybe there are some people that you should be screening. I would say maybe that's that probably happens in the tournament style. Whereas a staffer, if you're exhibiting certain traits or attributes that are not desirable, I would presume that you will either of your own accord leave because you don't fit the firm culture, or the firm will counsel you out, right, to go somewhere else. That comes up. It's a good question. It's hard. Do you think audit firms? Do I think it's based on commercialism values? I think there's some truth to it. The big part of our paper actually is on compensation. The compensation data was actually a bit rough, and so I wasn't able to run any tests on that. But we're actually going to test that. We're going to test if like commercial effort is related to compensation, right? And those types of things. And so actually in the future, I'll be able to provide some evidence one way or another about the extent to which that's actually associated with, with that. Our theory is yes. That it's part of it. It's part of the package. But we'll actually provide some empirical evidence about that. Good question. I think we're right up against time, Jan.
Yeah. I wish to thank you a lot for this introduction. And so we have this practitioner journal that is run by the Dutch Association of Auditors, and the general sentiment there is that that auditors do not do their best enough to actually improve quality. That's the general sentiment on that website. And and if you would ask that crowd, do you believe that commercialism is actually impacting quality negative? I haven't done this, but I bet that you get a yes, right? It is bad. It would be bad to quality. And what you have shown today that there's much more to it, right? Much more to think about. Yep. I also remember an auditor once that was extremely commercial, and I did doubt about his commitment to quality. But that is one person, right? That's not the whole bunch. So there's much more to that than people may be thinking at the first instance. And you gave us the first insights into that. And we're not there yet, and you're not there yet, but it's important for us to keep thinking about it. So I would like to thank you a lot, also on behalf of all the people who are, in this chat at this and in this meeting at this point. And we saw many people there's a few people for practice. Most of them are academics, but that is because it's of course busy season as well. Yes. But actually, that actually comes at a good time, maybe given where the paper is now. And I really hope that when you are in the next stage of the paper that you will present it again, because there's so much to talk about. It's really,
definitely.
Really great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
All right.
Thanks for now. And this is recorded, so I hope that you'll find if people can just watch this later on.
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
I also would like to thank all the participants today for their questions and their participation. Without participation, it's so dull. And
right, that's right.
Thanks to you, it was not right. So great that you all participated, and thank you, Will. That you are a great presenter. I really like how you present. So thanks also for that, and thank you all. Have a very nice day, and see you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.